The dining room fell silent the moment my father cleared his throat. I looked up from my phone to find both my parents staring at me with expressions I'd seen before. Serious. Decided. Final. My mother's hands were folded on the table. My father sat straight in his chair like he was chairing a board meeting. This wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be an announcement. "Maya, we need to discuss something important," Dad said. His voice had that tone, the one that meant he'd already made up his mind and was just informing me of the outcome. I set my phone down and waited. "Your grandmother's health is declining rapidly," Mom began. Her voice was softer than Dad's, but just as certain. "She needs full-time care, and we've decided the best option is to move her into the house with us." I nodded slowly. Grandma Helen had been struggling for months. This wasn't surprising news. What came next, though, caught me completely off guard. "We're converting your bedroom into a medical suite for her," Dad continued. "You'll move into the basement. We've already contacted the contractor. Work starts next month." For a moment, I just stared at them. My bedroom. The room I'd lived in for 23 years. The room where I'd studied for every exam, cried over every heartbreak, planned my entire future. They were giving it away without even asking me first. "Wait," I said carefully. "You're telling me this is already decided?" Mom reached across the table like she wanted to touch my hand, but stopped halfway. "Sweetheart, we know it's a big change. But Grandma needs proper care, and this is the most practical solution." "Practical for who?" The words came out sharper than I intended. Did anyone think to ask me how I felt about losing my room? Dad's expression hardened. That look I knew too well. The one that meant I was being difficult. "This isn't about feelings, Maya. This is about family responsibility. Your grandmother raised me. She deserves dignity in her final years." "I'm not saying she doesn't deserve care," I replied, forcing my voice to stay calm. "I'm saying maybe I deserve to be part of this conversation before you decided to rearrange my entire life." Dad set down his water glass with more force than necessary. The sound echoed in the quiet room. "You don't get a say in family decisions, Maya. You're still living under our roof, eating our food. When you're paying the mortgage, then you can have opinions about how we use the house." The words hit like a slap, not because they were cruel, but because they were said with such casual certainty. Like it was obvious. Like I should have known better than to expect otherwise. Mom jumped in quickly, her voice soothing. "What your father means is that as parents, we have to make difficult choices. We're doing what's best for everyone." But I barely heard her. I was stuck on Dad's words. "You don't get a say." Those 5 words seemed to hang in the air, growing heavier with each passing second. My face felt hot. My hands were shaking under the table where they couldn't see. "So that's it then," I said quietly. "You've decided. I moved to the basement. End of discussion." "We're glad you understand," Dad replied, already standing up from the table like the matter was closed. That night, I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling. My bed. My room. For how much longer? I replayed the conversation over and over, hearing Dad's voice each time. "You don't get a say." The certainty in his tone bothered me more than the actual decision. It was like I wasn't even a real person to them. Just a piece of furniture they could move around whenever it suited them. I heard my parents talking downstairs. Their voices were too low to make out words, but the tone was casual, relaxed. They'd already moved on. The difficult conversation was over, and now they could return to normal life. Tomorrow they'd call the contractor. Next week, they'd start ordering medical equipment. Everything would proceed exactly as planned. Because they assumed I'd accepted it. They assumed I'd do what I always did. Nod. Adapt. Make it work. That's who I'd always been. The easy daughter. The one who didn't cause problems. The one who understood that family meant sacrifice. But something felt different this time. The automatic acceptance didn't come. Instead, there was just this quiet, hollow feeling in my chest. The next morning, Mom acted like nothing had happened. She made pancakes and asked if I wanted chocolate chips or blueberries. Dad read the news on his tablet, occasionally commenting on articles. Everything was normal, comfortable, decided. "We're meeting with the contractor Tuesday afternoon," Mom mentioned casually while flipping pancakes. "He'll need to take measurements of your room. Make sure you're home by 3. I nodded and ate my breakfast in silence. Neither of them seemed to notice that I wasn't talking. Or maybe they noticed and assumed I was just adjusting. Either way, they didn't ask. Over the next few days, I watched them move through their plans with smooth efficiency. Dad researched medical bed options. Mom called Grandma's doctor to discuss care requirements. They spoke about timelines and logistics with the confidence of people who knew exactly how everything would unfold. And I said nothing. Not because I'd accepted their decision, but because arguing felt pointless. They'd made it clear my opinion didn't matter. So instead of fighting, I started paying attention. Really paying attention. To what they said, what they assumed, what they took for granted. A week passed. Then something triggered a memory I hadn't thought about in years. I was 20, fresh out of college, still figuring out my life. Dad had called me into his office one evening with a stack of papers. Legal documents. Just some formalities, he'd said, sliding them across the desk. The family trust needs updating, and we're adding you as a beneficiary. Sign here and here. I'd barely read them. Dad was a lawyer. Mom had worked in estate planning before I was born. I trusted them to handle the complicated stuff. So I signed where he pointed, dated, initialed, never asked what it really meant. Now, sitting in my room 3 years later, that moment felt different. The casualness of it, the way Dad had framed it as no big deal. Just formalities, just signatures, nothing to worry about. I went to my closet and pulled down the old filing box I kept on the top shelf. Inside were years of random documents, tax forms, college transcripts, and somewhere in there, copies of those papers I'd signed. I dumped everything onto my bed and started searching. It took 20 minutes to find them. A thick envelope marked Family Trust Documents. I spread the papers across my desk and started reading. Really reading this time. The language was dense and formal, full of legal terms I didn't fully understand. But some things were clear. The trust held several properties, investment accounts, the family home where we currently lived. And my name appeared, not just as a beneficiary, but as a co-trustee. Whatever that meant exactly, it seemed important. There were sections about decision-making authority, requirements for major transactions, multiple signatures needed for certain actions. I read the same paragraphs 3 and 4 times, trying to make sense of it. At the bottom of one page, I found a clause that made my stomach tighten. Any sale, transfer, or encumbrance of trust property requires unanimous consent of all trustees. I looked at the signature page. 3 names: Thomas Pierce, Victoria Pierce, Maya Pierce, my parents and me, all listed as trustees, not just beneficiaries. Trustees. I grabbed my laptop and started searching for definitions. What does a trustee do? What authority do they have? The answers that came back were clear. Trustees weren't just people who received benefits. They were decision-makers. They had legal power over trust assets, including, apparently, the house we lived in. The realization hit slowly, then all at once. I wasn't just living in my parents' house. According to these documents, I was one of 3 trustees who controlled it, that medical suite they wanted to build in my room, the contractor they'd already called, the decisions they'd made so confidently. All of it involved property that I had legal authority over. I sat back in my chair, staring at the papers spread across my desk. Dad had told me I didn't get a say in family decisions. But legally, it seemed I did, at least in this one very specific, very important way. My hands were shaking as I picked up the phone. I needed to understand this properly before I did anything. I couldn't just rely on internet searches and my own confused interpretation. I needed someone who actually knew how this stuff worked. I thought about calling Dad and asking him directly. He was a lawyer, after all. But something stopped me. The memory of his voice at dinner. The certainty. The dismissal. If I showed my hand too early, he'd find a way to explain it away. To make me doubt what I was seeing. No. I needed independent advice first. The next morning, I took a sick day for my job at the bookstore. I told my boss I had a dental emergency. Then I made an appointment with an estate attorney across town. Someone my parents didn't know. Someone who could give me a straight answer. The office was small but professional. The attorney, Miss Harrison, was maybe 50, with sharp eyes and a kind smile. I handed her the trust documents and explained the situation. She read through everything carefully, making notes on a yellow pad. "This is very clear," she finally said, looking up at me. You're a full trustee with equal authority to your parents. Any major decision about trust property requires all three signatures. Converting a room into a medical suite would likely qualify as a major alteration requiring consent. So they can't just do it without asking me? I asked, needing to hear it out loud. Legally, no. They need your formal written consent for any significant modification to the property. She paused, studying my face. Did they not explain this to you when you signed? I shook my head. They said it was just formalities, adding me as a beneficiary. Ms. Harrison's expression hardened slightly. You're not just a beneficiary. You're a decision-maker. That's a significant difference. I left the attorney's office feeling dizzy. Everything I thought I understood about my position in the family had just shifted. I wasn't the powerless daughter being told what to do. I was a legal equal in decisions about family property. Dad's words echoed differently now. You don't get a say. Except I did. He just didn't think I knew it. I drove home slowly, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do with this information? Confront them immediately? Use it as leverage? The thought of challenging my parents made my stomach twist. We'd never had that kind of relationship. I was the accommodating one. The peacemaker. The daughter who made things easier, not harder. But something had changed inside me. Maybe it was Dad's dismissive tone at dinner. Maybe it was the casual way they'd planned my life without me. Or maybe it was just finally understanding that I'd been letting them treat me like a child when legally I was their equal. When I got home, Dad was in his office on a conference call. Mom was in the kitchen making lists, contractor schedules, medical supply orders, everything moving forward exactly as planned. I stood in the doorway watching her work, and she looked up with a smile. Good news, she said. The contractor can start 2 weeks earlier than expected. I just nodded. Mom went back to her lists, satisfied with my silent acceptance. That's what they expected from me. Quiet agreement, gentle adaptation to whatever they decided. And for years, I'd given them exactly that. Not anymore. But I wasn't ready to show my cards yet. I needed time to think, to plan, to figure out exactly what I wanted and how to get it without destroying my relationship with my parents entirely. So I played along. I nodded when they talked about construction timelines. I asked polite questions about Grandma's care needs. I acted like the daughter they expected me to be. Inside, though, everything had changed. I started paying closer attention to their assumptions. The way Dad would make statements as if they were facts. The way Mom would phrase things as if my agreement was automatic. They weren't trying to be cruel. They genuinely believed this was how family worked. Parents decided. Children complied. That was the natural order. A few days later, Mom caught me off guard while we were doing dishes together. You're being so mature about all this, she said, squeezing my shoulder. Some daughters would throw fits about losing their bedroom. But you understand family comes first. The compliment felt like a trap, like she was reinforcing my role as the good daughter. The one who sacrificed without complaint. 2 weeks before the contractor was supposed to start, the questions began. Small at first. Casual. Mom would mention something about the basement and then glance at me. You're still okay with this, right? Her tone was light, but there was something underneath it. A tiny thread of uncertainty. I haven't said I'm not okay with it, I replied carefully. The distinction seemed to satisfy her at the moment, but the next day, Dad brought it up more directly. He found me in the living room reading and sat down across from me. Your mother's worried you're having second thoughts about the bedroom situation, he said. Not asking. Stating. I told her you're fine. You understand this is necessary. I looked up from my book. Did you tell her that? Or did you just assume it? His eyes narrowed slightly. Is there a difference? I think there might be, I said, keeping my voice neutral. You've told me what's happening. You haven't asked me if I agree. Dad's jaw tightened. We've been through this, Maya. This isn't a negotiation. It's a family decision made for family reasons. I know, I replied. I just think it's interesting that you're so certain I'll go along with it. I went back to my book, leaving the statement hanging in the air between us. He sat there for another moment, clearly wanting to say more. Then he stood abruptly and left the room. That conversation seemed to trigger something. Over the next few days, both parents started watching me more carefully, looking for signs of rebellion, waiting for me to explode or argue or demand my way. But I gave them nothing. Just calm, noncommittal responses. Neither yes nor no. Just acknowledgement that I'd heard them. It was driving them crazy. I could tell. While they worried about my silence, I was making my own quiet preparations. I'd been living paycheck to paycheck for years, never bothering to save much since I wasn't paying rent at home. That needed to change. I started putting money aside. Not a lot. Just enough to give me options if things went badly. I also updated my resume and started looking at apartments. Nothing serious yet, just knowing what was out there. What I could afford if I needed to move out tomorrow. The research made me feel less trapped, less dependent on their goodwill. I contacted a few old college friends who'd moved to different cities. Casual conversations. How's the job market there? What's rent like? Building a mental map of possibilities. Places I could go if home became impossible. None of this was about running away. It was about making sure I could stand on my own feet, no matter what happened next. 3 days before construction was supposed to start, Dad got a call. I was upstairs, but I heard his voice change. Professional. Guarded. He said something about the trust property and scheduled modifications. Then a long pause. When he spoke again, his tone was different. Careful. An hour later, both parents called me into the dining room. The same room where this had all started. But this time, they looked uncertain. There's been a small complication, Mom began, choosing her words carefully. The contractor needs some additional paperwork before he can start work. What kind of paperwork? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Dad cleared his throat. Because the house is held in the family trust, any major modifications require formal consent from all trustees. It's just a technicality. A form you'll need to sign. A consent form, I said slowly. For the medical suite in my room. Exactly, Mom said, smiling with relief. Just a formality. The contractor said he needs it by tomorrow to stay on schedule. They slid a document across the table. I picked it up and read through it carefully. It was exactly what Miss Harrison had described. Formal consent for substantial alterations to trust property. My signature line was at the bottom, right next to where my parents had already signed. I set the paper down gently. Both parents watched me expectantly, waiting for me to grab a pen and scribble my name. To do what I always did. Make things easy. Go along with the plan. This is interesting, I said quietly. When did you both sign this? Dad glanced at the date. This morning. As soon as we received it from the contractor. And you assumed I'd sign it too. Today. Right now. Well, yes, Mom said, her smile faltering. It's what we discussed. What we all agreed to. I met her eyes. We never agreed to anything. You told me what you decided. I never said yes. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Dad's face was turning red. The color that meant his patience was running out. Maya, this is not the time for games. The contractor starts Monday. We need this signed tonight. I understand that, I replied, keeping my voice calm even though my heart was pounding. But I need time to think about it. Think about what? Dad's voice was rising now. Your grandmother needs care. We've made all the arrangements. Everything is set. You're really going to hold this up over a technicality? It's not a technicality to me, I said. It's my room. My life. My signature on a legal document. I think I deserve at least a few days to consider it. Mom looked like I'd slapped her. Maya, we're your parents. Don't you trust us to make good decisions for the family? The question hung in the air. How could I explain that trust wasn't the issue? That this was about respect. About being treated like an adult instead of an obstacle to be managed. I trust that you believe this is the right decision, I said carefully. But that doesn't mean I automatically agree. Dad stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is ridiculous. You're being difficult for no reason. I'm being difficult? The words came out sharper than I intended. You made a major decision about my living situation without asking me. You hired a contractor without my consent. You planned everything assuming I'd just go along with it. And now I'm difficult because I want a few days to think. You've had weeks to think, Dad shot back. We discussed this at dinner a month ago. You announced it to me. There's a difference. He stared at me for a long moment. I could see him recalculating, trying to figure out where the obedient daughter had gone and who this person was in her place. Finally, he took a breath and forced his voice to soften. How much time do you need? A week, I said. It was arbitrary. I just needed them to understand I wasn't going to be pushed. That's unacceptable, Dad replied immediately. The contractor has a schedule. Other jobs lined up. If we delay, we might lose him for months. Mom tried a different approach. Sweetheart, I know this feels sudden, but remember all the times we've made sacrifices for you. The college we couldn't really afford. The car we bought you when yours died. Moving across the country for your father's job, even though I loved Boston. She was rewriting history, making it sound like my entire life had been them giving and me taking. Creating a debt I was now refusing to repay. The manipulation was so smooth I almost didn't notice it happening. I'm grateful for everything you've done, I said carefully. But that doesn't mean I owe you automatic agreement for the rest of my life. That's not what we're asking, Mom insisted. We're asking you to help your grandmother. Family helps family. That's what love looks like. The guilt tactic was familiar. I'd fallen for it 1,000 times before. But this time I saw it for what it was. A tool to get what they wanted. A way to make my hesitation seem selfish and cruel. I love Grandma, I said quietly. This isn't about her. This is about being included in decisions that affect my life. Dad made a frustrated sound. Everything affects everyone's life in a family. That's how it works. We can't stop and have a committee meeting every time something needs to be done. I'm not asking for committee meetings. I'm asking for basic respect. The argument went in circles for another 30 minutes. Eventually, we reached an uneasy truce. They couldn't force me to sign. I couldn't ignore them forever. We all knew the power dynamic had shifted, but nobody wanted to acknowledge it directly. Fine, Dad finally said, his voice tight. You have until Friday. 3 days. But Maya, I want you to think carefully about what you're doing. This isn't just about you. It's about your grandmother's health and dignity. Another guilt trip. Another attempt to make my boundary seem like cruelty. I nodded without agreeing to anything. That night, my phone rang. Dad's name on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. Maya. His voice was different now. Not commanding. Almost gentle. I think we got off on the wrong foot earlier. Your mother and I were just stressed about Grandma's situation. We didn't mean to make you feel like your feelings don't matter. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from him. But it still wasn't real acknowledgement. Just stress management. Smoothing things over so I comply. I understand you're stressed, I replied carefully. I am too. That's why I need time to process this properly. Of course. Take your time. His voice was warm now. Accommodating. We just hope you'll make the right choice. The family choice. After we hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about that phrase. The family choice. As if there was only one right answer, and anything else was betrayal. Friday came. I didn't sign the form. Dad called the contractor and made excuses. Delayed the start date. I could hear the tension in his voice through my bedroom wall. The careful professionalism barely covering his frustration. Over the weekend, the atmosphere in the house changed. The careful politeness evaporated. Dad stopped trying to manage me and went straight to anger. Mom oscillated between guilt trips and cold silence. Sunday dinner was excruciating. We sat at the same table where this had all started. But now the pretense of family harmony was gone. Dad's jaw was clenched. Mom's eyes were red from crying. And I sat there feeling like a stranger in my own home. Are you proud of yourself? Dad finally asked, setting down his fork with deliberate precision. Your grandmother needs help, and you're playing power games like a child. I haven't said no, I replied quietly. I said I needed time. You're the one who's treating my reasonable request like betrayal. Reasonable. Mom's voice cracked. There's nothing reasonable about this, Maya. You're being selfish and you know it. I took a breath, trying to stay calm. I'm being selfish for wanting to be included in decisions about my own life. This isn't about you. Dad's voice rose. When are you going to understand that? This is about your grandmother. About family. About doing what's right instead of what's convenient for you. The accusation stung. But underneath the sting was clarity. They genuinely couldn't see any perspective but their own. In their minds, they'd made the obviously correct decision, and my hesitation was pure selfishness. There was no room in their worldview for me to have valid concerns or needs that might conflict with their plans. Mom leaned forward, her voice dropping to something almost pleading. We raised you better than this. We taught you that family comes first. That sometimes we sacrifice our wants for people we love. What happened to that girl? She grew up, I said quietly, and realized that sacrifice shouldn't mean silence. Dad stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. This is pointless. You've made your position clear, Maya. You care more about your bedroom than your grandmother's health. Fine. We'll figure something else out. But don't expect us to forget this. He walked out. Mom followed, leaving me alone at the dinner table. I could hear them upstairs, talking in low, angry voices, planning their next move without me. Again. Later that night, Mom came to my door. Her face was composed now. Cold. Your father and I have been discussing things. We think it's best if you find your own place. If you're going to act like a tenant instead of family, you should actually be a tenant somewhere else. The threat was clear. Sign the form or leave. Choose compliance or homelessness. When do you want me out? I asked, keeping my voice steady, even though my hands were shaking. 2 weeks should be sufficient. She turned to leave, then paused. We never thought you'd choose yourself over family, Maya. We're very disappointed. After she left, I sat on my bed staring at the walls I'd grown up with. The walls they were so eager to repurpose. Part of me wanted to cave, to sign the form, apologize, go back to being the daughter they wanted. It would be so much easier than this constant tension. But I couldn't. Something fundamental had shifted. I'd seen how little my voice mattered to them. How quickly their love became conditional when I stopped being convenient. And I couldn't unsee it. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Ms. Harrison again. She listened to everything that had happened and made notes. They're trying to force you out, she said finally. But legally, they can't evict you from property you have trustee authority over. That's the irony here. You have as much right to live in that house as they do. But I don't want to live there anymore, I admitted. Not like this. Not with them looking at me like I'm the enemy. I understand. But you should know your options before you make decisions based on emotion. She pulled out the trust documents again. There's another aspect to this you might not have considered. If you're uncomfortable with your role as trustee, you could petition to dissolve or modify the trust. That would give you your share of the assets and remove you from decision-making authority. My heart skipped. What does that mean exactly? It means you get your portion of the trust value, including your share of the house equity. It wouldn't be a small amount. I spent the next 2 days researching my options. The trust held significant value. Properties, investments. My third would be enough to start over completely. Buy my own place, build my own life. But pursuing that option would essentially blow up my relationship with my parents permanently. Was I ready for that? To choose money and independence over family? The question kept me awake at night. Then Dad made the decision easier. He called a family meeting, without telling me what it was about. When I came downstairs, I found both parents with Grandma Helen. She looked confused and frail in the living room chair. Maya, Dad said, his voice formal. We wanted Grandma to hear directly from you why you're refusing to help her. The manipulation was breathtaking. They brought my sick grandmother into this as a weapon, as evidence of my cruelty. Grandma looked at me with watery eyes, not understanding what was happening. I'm not refusing to help Grandma, I said, keeping my voice gentle. I've never said that. Then sign the consent form, Dad replied. Prove you care about her welfare more than your comfort. I looked at my grandmother, at my parents, at the trap they'd carefully constructed, and I made my choice. I'll sign, I said quietly, but not the form you want. I'm going to petition to exit the trust. You can convert my room. You can make any decisions you want. You just won't need my consent anymore. The silence that followed my announcement was absolute. Mom's face went pale. Dad's eyes widened. They clearly hadn't expected this, hadn't even considered it as a possibility. You can't do that, Dad said, but his voice lacked conviction. Actually, I can. I've consulted with an attorney. Any trustee can petition to exit the trust and receive their proportional share of assets. It's all laid out in the trust documents. The ones you had me sign without explaining what they really meant. Mom found her voice. Maya, you don't understand what you're saying. That would require liquidating assets, selling properties. It would destroy everything we've built. No, I corrected. It would give me what's legally mine. You'd keep your portions. You just wouldn't have access to mine anymore. Dad's face was turning red. This is extortion. You're holding the family hostage to get money. I'm removing myself from a situation where I have responsibility but no respect. You told me I don't get a say in family decisions. Fine. After this, I won't have to. You can make whatever choices you want without needing my consent. Your share of this trust is meant for your future, Mom said desperately. Your security. If you take it now, you'll waste it. You don't know how to manage that kind of money. I almost laughed at that. Even now, they couldn't help treating me like a child. I'll manage. Or I won't. But it'll be my choice. Not yours. That afternoon, I met with Ms. Harrison and formally began the trust dissolution process. The paperwork was complex but clear. Within 6 months, assuming the courts agreed, I'd receive approximately $340,000. My third of the trust's total value. Enough to buy a small condo. Start my life completely independent of my parents' control. The news hit my parents like a bomb. Dad tried everything. Threats, guilt, promises of reform if I'd just reconsider. Mom cried. Grandma was quietly moved to a care facility since the home conversion was now impossible. And through it all I stayed firm. Not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I finally understood something crucial. They didn't respect me. They loved me, maybe. But they didn't respect me as an autonomous adult with my own needs and boundaries. And I couldn't live my entire life waiting for them to change. The legal process moved slowly. Valuations, negotiations, court filings. My parents hired their own attorney and tried to contest everything. But the trust documents were clear. I had the right to exit. They couldn't stop me. During those months, I barely spoke to them. I moved into a friend's spare room to avoid the toxic atmosphere at home. They sent messages through relatives, tried to get Grandma to guilt me, told everyone who would listen that I'd chosen money over family. Maybe they were right. Or maybe I'd chosen self-respect over convenience. Depended on how you looked at it. 6 months later, I sat in a lawyer's office signing the final documents. My parents were at the other end of the conference table with their attorney. We barely made eye contact all morning. The process was sterile, professional, painful in its formality. When the last signature was placed, the mediator confirmed the transfer. Within 3 business days, $340,000 would be deposited into my account. The trust would continue with my parents as the sole trustees. I'd have no further claim to trust assets, no further obligations. I was finally free. As we stood to leave, Dad caught my arm. I hope you know what you've done, he said quietly. You've broken this family for money. I met his eyes. No, Dad. I set a boundary, and you couldn't accept it. This was always your choice. You could have included me. You could have asked instead of commanded. But you chose to see my independence as betrayal. Mom was crying silently. We only wanted what was best for you. I know. But you wanted it on your terms. You never asked what I wanted. What I needed. I paused at the door. Maybe someday we can rebuild something. But it has to be different. It has to include actually listening to me. I left them standing there and walked out into the parking lot. My phone was already buzzing with the bank notification. Funds received. The money felt surreal at first. I'd gone from living paycheck to having more in my account than I'd earned in 5 years at the bookstore. The temptation to do something dramatic was strong. Quit my job. Travel the world. Buy a flashy car. Instead, I did the boring, practical thing. I hired a financial advisor. Put most of it in conservative investments. Used a portion for a down payment on a small 2-bedroom condo across town. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. Completely mine. No one could take it away or repurpose my bedroom for family needs. Moving day was strange. My parents didn't help. Didn't call. I'd expected that. What I hadn't expected was the relief I felt closing the door of my new place and knowing I'd never have to ask permission or approval for how I lived in this space. Work became different too. Before, the bookstore job was just something to fill time while I figured out my real future. Now it felt like choice instead of default. I wasn't there because I had nowhere else to go. I was there because I wanted to be. That subtle shift made everything easier. My coworker, Jasmine, noticed a change. You seem different lately, she said one afternoon while we were restocking. Lighter, somehow. I feel lighter, I admitted. Like I've been carrying weight I didn't even know was there. She smiled knowingly. Family stuff. How'd you guess? It's always family stuff. 3 months after the trust settlement, I got a call from my aunt. Not from my parents directly. Never directly. That wasn't how our family worked. We communicated through intermediaries. Avoided direct confrontation. Your mother's birthday is next week, Aunt Brenda said carefully. She'd never admit it, but I think she's hoping you'll call. Has she tried calling me? I asked, though I knew the answer. A pause. You know how your parents are. Prideful. They think you should apologize first. Apologize for what? Wanting control over my own life. I'm not taking sides, honey. I just think maybe enough time has passed. Maybe you could be the bigger person here. The bigger person. Code for the one who gives in. The one who swallows their hurt and pretends everything's fine. I'd played that role my whole life. I wasn't sure I wanted it anymore. I'll think about it, I said, which was my polite way of saying probably not. After we hung up, I did think about it. Was I holding a grudge? Being stubborn for its own sake? Or was I protecting a boundary that needed protecting? I thought about calling. Imagine the conversation. How it would go? Mom would be passive-aggressive. Dad would be stiff and formal. Neither would actually apologize or acknowledge what they'd done. They'd expect me to pretend it never happened. To come back to being the accommodating daughter who made things easy. I couldn't do it. Not yet. The holidays were hard. Thanksgiving came and went without an invitation to my parents' house. I spent it with Jasmine's family instead. They were loud and chaotic and warm. Nobody expected me to be anything other than myself. It was nice, but it also highlighted what I'd lost. Christmas was worse. I drove past my childhood home on the way to a friend's party. Saw the lights in the windows. Cars in the driveway. Extended family gathered inside. A celebration I wasn't part of anymore. The exclusion hurt in a way I hadn't anticipated. I almost turned around. Almost knocked on the door and asked to come in. But I knew what would happen. They'd be polite. Chilly. I'd feel like a guest in the house I grew up in. And nothing would actually be resolved. We'd just paper over the wound with forced pleasantries and pretend it had healed. Instead, I kept driving. Went to the party. Drank too much wine. Cried in my friend's bathroom at midnight. Not because I regretted my choice, but because choosing yourself sometimes means accepting loss. And that loss is real even when the choice was right. New Year's came with its traditional pressure to make resolutions. I didn't make any dramatic declarations. Just a quiet commitment to keep building the life I wanted. To stop waiting for my parents to change and start accepting them as they were. 4 months after the settlement, something unexpected happened. I was at a coffee shop near my condo when I saw Mom. She was alone, standing in line, looking smaller somehow. Older. We made eye contact. For a second, I thought she might leave, but instead, she walked over. Maya, she said quietly, can we talk? We sat at a corner table with our drinks between us like a barrier. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Your father doesn't know I'm here, she finally said. He'd be furious if he found out. Why are you here then? She stirred her coffee absently. Because I miss you. Because Grandma asks about you. Because this whole thing has been awful and I don't know how to fix it. You could start by acknowledging that I had valid reasons for doing what I did. Mom's face tightened. I don't know if I can do that. What you did, taking the money, dissolving the trust, it hurt us, Maya. It felt like you chose wealth over family. I chose respect over compliance, I corrected. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I'm sitting, you threw away your relationship with your parents over a bedroom. I took a breath, trying to stay calm. It was never about the bedroom. It was about being told I had no say in decisions that affected my entire life. It was about being treated like my opinions and feelings were obstacles to be managed instead of valued. Mom looked away, blinking rapidly. When she spoke again, her voice was tight. We were trying to do the right thing. For Grandma. For the family. You made it impossible. No. You made a plan without me and expected me to fall in line. When I asked for time to process it, you made me the villain. You tried to guilt me using Grandma. You threatened to kick me out. And when none of that worked, you acted like I was destroying the family by asserting a legal right I had every reason to use. We were scared, Mom said quietly. Your father's retirement is tied up in that trust. The house, the investments, it's our security. When you threatened to dissolve it, you weren't just taking your share. You were putting our future at risk. This was new information. I'd assumed they were just angry about losing control. I hadn't considered they might be genuinely worried about financial stability. Why didn't you tell me that? I asked. Why didn't you explain the situation instead of just commanding me to obey? Because your father, she stopped, seeming to catch herself. Because we thought you'd understand without needing everything spelled out. We thought family loyalty would be enough. Loyalty isn't the same as blind obedience, Mom. She was quiet for a long moment. Then softly, I know. I'm starting to understand that now. But I don't know how to tell your father that. He's so angry, Maya. He feels betrayed. We talked for another hour. It wasn't a resolution. Mom didn't apologize, and I didn't back down. But it was the first real conversation we'd had in months. The first time she'd acknowledged, even slightly, that maybe they'd handled things wrong. I can't promise your father will come around, she said as we stood to leave. His pride won't let him admit he was wrong. But maybe, eventually, we can find a way past this. I'd like that, I said honestly. But Mom, it has to be different going forward. You can't treat me like a child who needs to be managed. I'm an adult. I deserve to be part of conversations about things that affect me. She nodded slowly. I'll try. I can't promise your father will, but I'll try. We hugged briefly, awkwardly, like distant relatives instead of mother and daughter. But it was something. A small crack in the wall we'd built between us. I walked back to my condo feeling lighter. Not resolved exactly, but hopeful that maybe someday we could rebuild something. It would never be what it was before. That relationship was gone. But maybe we could build something new. Something with actual respect at its foundation. 6 months later, I got a card in the mail. My father's handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a simple birthday card with a check for $500 and a note. We don't agree with your choices, but we're trying to understand them. Happy birthday. Dad. It wasn't an apology. Wasn't even close. But it was acknowledgement. A small gesture that said maybe he was softening. Maybe time was doing what arguments couldn't. I didn't cash the check. Instead, I called him. The conversation was stilted and brief. We talked about weather and work and carefully avoided anything substantial. But we talked. That was something. Mom started texting occasionally. Pictures of Grandma. Updates about family events. Always casual. Never pushing. I responded when I could. Kept things light. We were rebuilding slowly. Carefully. Like people who'd been burned and weren't sure how close they could get to the fire again. The weird thing was, I didn't regret any of it. The confrontation. The trust dissolution. The months of estrangement. All of it had been necessary. Painful, but necessary. Because now when we interacted, it was different. They couldn't make assumptions about my compliance anymore. They had to actually ask. Actually consider that I might say no. That shift changed everything. A year after the settlement, I was promoted to assistant manager at the bookstore. It wasn't a dream job, but it was progress. More importantly, it was a choice I made for myself. Not because I was stuck. Not because I had no other options. But because I genuinely enjoyed the work and the people. My condo appreciated in value. The investments my financial advisor recommended performed well. I wasn't rich, but I was stable. Secure in a way I'd never been while living under my parents' roof. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd warned that I'd waste the money, that I'd regret leaving their protection. But I'd done the opposite. I'd built something sustainable. Jasmine and I became close friends. Real friends, not just coworkers. She knew the whole story with my parents and never judged. Just listened when I needed to talk and made me laugh when I needed distraction. You know what I respect about you, she said one night over wine at my place. You actually did it. Most people stay stuck in toxic family situations because they're scared of being alone. You chose yourself. That takes guts. It didn't feel brave at the time, I admitted. It felt terrifying. That's what makes it brave. Being scared and doing it anyway. Maybe she was right. Maybe the whole nightmare had been my own strange kind of courage. Not the loud, obvious kind. The quiet kind. The kind that says, I deserve better, and actually believes it. 18 months after the trust settlement, my parents invited me to Thanksgiving. Not through an intermediary this time. A direct call from Mom. We'd like you to come, she said simply. If you're willing. I went. Not because everything was fixed, but because I wanted to try. The dinner was awkward but civil. Dad barely spoke to me directly. But he didn't ignore me either. Just maintained a careful, formal distance. Mom tried too hard to make everything normal. Laughed too loud at jokes. Filled silences with chatter. But we got through it. No fights. No dramatic confrontations. Just a meal with people who were slowly learning how to be family in a new way. After dinner, Dad caught me in the hallway. Your mother says you got promoted. Assistant manager. Not exactly CEO, but it's something. It's good you're building a career. He paused, clearly uncomfortable. I won't say I agree with how everything happened, but I can admit you've handled yourself well since. More maturely than I expected. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd probably ever get. An acknowledgement that maybe he'd underestimated me. That maybe I was more capable than he'd given me credit for. Thanks, Dad. That means something. He nodded and walked away. Progress came in small steps with parents like mine. You couldn't expect grand gestures or tearful apologies. Just tiny shifts in understanding. Barely visible changes in how they saw you. 2 years after the trust settlement, I could finally look back on everything with some clarity. The choice I'd made hadn't been about money. It had been about power. Not power over my parents, but power over my own life. The ability to say no. To set boundaries. To demand respect instead of begging for it. The financial independence had been the tool, not the goal. Having my own money meant I could walk away from situations that weren't healthy. Could refuse to accept treatment I didn't deserve. Could build a life that reflected my values instead of theirs. My relationship with my parents would never be warm and easy. Too much damage. Too much hurt. But it was honest now. Real. We didn't pretend everything was perfect. Didn't sweep conflict under the rug. We acknowledged our limits and worked within them. Dad still didn't understand my choices. Probably never would. His worldview didn't have room for daughters who chose themselves over family obligations. But he'd learned to live with it. To accept that I wasn't going to be the daughter he'd expected. Mom had come further. She'd actually apologized once, late at night over the phone. For not listening. For treating my needs as less important. For failing to defend me when Dad got aggressive. It wasn't everything. But it was something. The most unexpected thing was Grandma. She'd been moved to a nice care facility when the home conversion fell through. I visited her regularly. Brought her flowers. Sat with her when she was having good days. One afternoon, she was particularly lucid. She grabbed my hand with surprising strength. I heard what happened. With the trust. With your parents. I tensed, expecting criticism. Expecting her to side with her son. Instead, she smiled. Good for you, she said firmly. I spent my whole life bending to what men told me to do. Your grandfather, your father, never had the courage to stand up for myself. I'm glad you did. I almost cried. All this time, I'd assumed she'd think I was selfish. Ungrateful. But she understood. Maybe better than anyone. They're not bad people, she continued. Just stubborn. Set in their ways. They love you. They just don't know how to show it except by controlling things. I know. I love them too. It's just hard. Being family is always hard. But it's worth it when you can be yourself while doing it. She squeezed my hand. Don't let them make you small again, Maya. You're better than that. Those words stayed with me. Don't let them make you small. That's what had happened for so many years. I'd shrunk myself to fit their expectations. Made myself smaller so they could feel bigger. The trust battle had forced me to expand back to my full size. To take up space, unapologetically. 3 years after everything fell apart and began to rebuild, I sat in my condo looking at old photos. Pictures from childhood, birthday parties, holidays, school events. In every photo I was smiling, playing the part of the happy daughter, the easy child. But looking closer, I could see the strain. The performance of it. The way I'd molded myself to their expectations so thoroughly I'd forgotten I was even doing it. That girl was gone now. Not lost. Just evolved. She'd grown into someone harder. Clearer. Less willing to compromise herself for the comfort of others. Some people might see that as a loss. I saw it as survival. My phone buzzed. A text from Mom. Your father and I are downsizing. Moving to a smaller place. Thought you might want some of your childhood things before we donate them. The family home was being sold. The house they tried to convert without my permission. The trust property that had started this whole mess. There was poetry in that somehow. I drove over the next weekend. The house felt different. Smaller. Like returning to your elementary school as an adult and realizing it was never as big as you remembered. Mom had boxes set up in my old room. My actual old room, not the medical suite it almost became. I sorted through yearbooks, old toys, clothes I'd loved once. Each item a reminder of who I'd been. Who I'd thought I had to be. Dad appeared in the doorway while I was packing. He looked older than I remembered. Tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. We're selling to a young family, he said. 2 kids. They're excited about the space. That's nice. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I've been thinking a lot about what happened. With the trust. With everything. I stopped packing and looked at him. I still think you were wrong to dissolve it, he continued. But I understand now why you felt you had to. We didn't give you much choice. It was the closest he'd ever come to admitting fault. To acknowledging his part in how things went wrong. We both made choices we can't undo, I said carefully. Maybe that's okay. Maybe we just have to accept that and move forward. He nodded slowly. Your mother wants to have dinner. Real dinner. Not just holidays. Maybe once a month or so. I'd like that. So would I. He turned to leave, then paused. You've done well for yourself, Maya. Better than I expected. I'm proud of you, even if I'm bad at showing it. After he left, I sat among the boxes crying quietly. Not sad tears exactly. Just release. The acknowledgement I'd been waiting for. Not perfect. Not complete. But real. The dinner started a new tradition. Once a month, we'd meet at a neutral restaurant. Not their house. Not mine. Somewhere neither of us had home field advantage. We'd talk about safe things mostly. Work. Friends. Books I was reading. Dad's golf game. Mom's garden. Sometimes we'd venture into harder territory. They'd ask about my life plans. I'd ask about their retirement. We'd disagree sometimes, but without the old intensity. Without the assumption that disagreement meant betrayal. It wasn't the relationship we'd had before. It was smaller. More bounded. But it was honest. We all knew exactly where we stood with each other. What we could expect and what was off limits. Some people might see that as sad. A family that couldn't be fully close. But I saw it as healthy. We'd acknowledged our limits and chosen to work within them rather than pretending they didn't exist. Jasmine got engaged. Asked me to be a bridesmaid. At the wedding, she introduced me to her cousin. We talked for hours about books and travel and terrible jobs we'd survived. He asked for my number. I gave it. Life was moving forward. Not dramatically. Just steadily. I was building something real. Something that wasn't contingent on anyone else's approval. 5 years after I'd stood in my parents' dining room and been told I didn't get a say in family decisions, I understood something fundamental. They'd been right in a way. I didn't get a say in their choices, their lives, their priorities, but they didn't get a say in mine either. That mutual independence had been terrifying at first, but it had also been necessary. We'd spent so many years tangled up in each other's expectations that we couldn't see where one person ended and another began. The trust dissolution had been brutal surgery, cutting away the financial and emotional enmeshment that made us feel close but actually just made us stuck. The scar tissue was still there, probably always would be, but we could all breathe easier now. I thought about the girl I'd been, the one who signed papers without reading them, who accepted decisions without question, who believed that love meant automatic agreement. She'd learned the hard way that silence isn't peace, that compliance isn't harmony, that sometimes the people who love you most will make you small without even realizing they're doing it. The lesson had cost me. Money I'd had to fight for. Years of strained relationships. The comfortable illusion that my parents were infallible and had my best interests at heart above their own. But what I'd gained was worth it. Control over my own life. the ability to set boundaries and enforce them, the understanding that respect isn't something you earn through obedience. It's something you demand through self-worth. People who tell you that you have no say often build their future on your silence. Until one day, they actually need your consent. And you finally understand that your voice has always had power. You were just taught not to use it. I used mine. And everything changed.